agenda. So we are going to our last but not least session, the unlocking climate finance for Paris Agreement implementation in Indonesia. This session will be moderated by Mr. Wahyudi Wardoyo, Senior Advisor to the Minister of Environment and Forestry. And all the speakers is ready, so without further ado, to Mr. Wahyudi Wardoyo, please come to the stage. And we will begin the session of unlocking climate finance for implementation in Indonesia. Now, to Mr. Wahyudi, the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody. We would like to start with the last session today. The last session will be unlocking climate finance to support Paris Agreement implementations. I'd like to invite all speakers here. First, Dr. Ruanda Sugardiman. Second, Ms. Dewanti. And the third, Mr. Simon Buckle from OECD. Mana? Yeah, please. Thank you. I think it's better all of speakers there. Pak Rwanda, Bu Laksmi, langsung di sana aja. Belum ada ya. Okay, while we are waiting for the second speaker, Mrs. Laksmi Dewanti, I think it's better for us to start. This session is, again, as I mentioned, will be unlocking climate finance to support Paris Agreement implementations. Since in the morning, we have discussed several things regarding with policies, regarding with science-based and technical implementations. But this session is, I think, will be very, very important for us because we thought MOI, means of implementations, we will not going somewhere if we are going to implement Paris Agreement. So if you know, MOI, which consists of three main issues: finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. So in this session, we are fortunate. We have three different speakers. First, Director General of Climate Change, Dr. Ruanda Sugardiman. And secondly, Mr. Simon Buckle, Head of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Water Division from OECD. And actually another one is Mrs. Laksmi Dewanti, the Senior Advisor to the Minister of Environment and Forestry on Industry and International Trade. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Mr. Dr. Ruanda Sugardiman to give a presentation. Please.
The presentation, please. Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, this afternoon I will present the Indonesian need to support NDC implementation in Indonesia. Yes, the Indonesian important milestone in climate forum. We started involved in the climate area since 1994 when we ratified the UNFCCC of Indonesia. And then we also ratified the Kyoto Protocol on 2004. And then we established the National Action Plan for Climate Change in 2007. And then in Indonesia there is a COP13 in Bali. And from that we include our climate change in the National Development Planning of Indonesia 2010. And then also we have a roadmap of Indonesia climate change. So several activities already there. And then in 2014, the National Action Plan on the climate change include in our midterm development plan 2010 and 2014. And then we have also National Action Plan on reducing greenhouse gas 2011. And then we submit our NDC 2015. And then we have the Indonesia NDC that we have submit to UN on November 2016. And then now we have to prepare for the updating the NDCs. So this is the milestone of Indonesia activities on the climate change. As I mentioned before in the session before, that's we have a 29% to reduce the emission, and from that 17.2% is come from forestry sector. So as Dr. Wahyudi mentioned, this is the Paris Agreement and NDC and its implementation on the global and national level. This is when we are here doing negotiation in COP. There are several activities we negotiating in the room. For example, the transparency works, global stocktake, and also the most important what we are discussing this afternoon is about the mean of implementation. So finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. That one Indonesia need support to run the implementation of the NDCs. So from the 17.2% in the forest activities, the activities of forestry area, most of them come from the REDD plus of Indonesia, where the mitigation action from the forestry sector with the policy approach and positive incentive, an important component to achieve contribution target in Indonesia NDCs from land-based sector and in line with the direction of sustainable development. From that one, we know there are 4 major activities in the REDD+, reducing the deforestation, reducing emission from the forest degradation, role of conservation, sustainable management of forest, and enhanced forest carbon stock. From that one, we have the area where the activity of REDD+ will be done in the field. So from that one, from the activities, we need the investment for the 5 sector, from forestry, energy, industry, and also waste and agriculture. So this is the investment what we need to implement the NDC. The several activities there to be supported by the international and the national budget. From that one, we can make a map, the source of funding, the domestic fund and the international funding, which one is come from and how we can achieve this funding to achieve our NDC implementations. And the strategy of a climate finance, there are 3 big activities in Indonesia. we already established the national financial mechanism through the Public Service Agency of the Environmental Fund. We call it the Environmental Fund. And the second one is the enhanced bilateral and multilateral cooperation. And also we engage the non-party stakeholder. This is a strategy how we can funding the activity of implementation of the NDC activities. So this I will explain to you with the agency of the Environmental Fund of Indonesia, the legal basis from the government regulation, so the presidential regulation. So there are fund of the management. We can collect the funding. We have invest the funding and also distribution the funding. From that we can generate the sources of for funding for the NDC implementation. That's what I want to tell Pak Wahyudi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruanda. It is the policy from the government of Indonesia regarding the finance. As I mentioned, that we cannot do anything without MY. And this afternoon, we will focus on finance. Because without finance, it's like engine without fuel. So the engine will stuck without any movement. So that's why Indonesia also set the kind of commitments and policy dealing with this. The second speaker, I'd like to invite Mrs. Dewanti to explain more about commitment and policies for Indonesia dealing with public service on finance. Please, Ibu.
Thank you, Pak Wardoyo, the moderator. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good afternoon. My name is Laksmi Dewanti, and I was asked to share with you a framework of Indonesia policy on financing environmental protection and management program, including the climate change mitigations and adaptation actions. Various reports say that climate challenge could also be seen as an opportunity to create new sources of growth by placing the climate imperative at the core of the national growth and development strategy. And indeed, Indonesia is doing so. So achieving climate-compatible growth will require government to pursue growth-enhancing fiscal policy, resilient investment, with efficient and cost-effective climate policy. Of course, Indonesia is also doing it. And the timing and mix of the policy intervention will very much depend on the country different circumstances. I think for Indonesia, the low carbon development strategy, or including the mitigation and adaptations pathway, are equally important. And it has to be specific to address the Indonesian circumstances. We already learned from Mr. Sugardiman how strong commitment of Indonesia to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions through NDC implementations. So I won't rephrase this commitment. But I will also, I only would like to emphasize the policy messages of the NDC implementation in Indonesia. One, we need to integrate the climate imperative into the structural reform and broader national development strategies. Second, we need to speed up collective, collaborative national effort toward full implementations of the Paris Agreement. And the third, we need to realize the greenhouse gas mitigation potential across the economic sectors. And the most importantly, as we speak during and as a theme of this COP25, time for actions. For me, time for actions indeed a time to mobilize resources. Otherwise, as Mr. Moderator mentioned, without finance, kind of engine without fuels. So, and according to the Indonesia Third National Communications, the country will need about 91 billion US dollar to finance mitigation and adaptation actions in 2015 to 2020. And the number will be increased for further years, 2020 to 2030. The climate action need a strategic policy, financing collaborations among stakeholders in the local and the global levels. Of course, the government budget alone will not be able to meet the financing needs for the climate change actions, including to develop many actions like Mr. Sugardiman mentioned on energy sector, on forest sector, on waste sector, and other sectors. So the progressive step is needed to scaling up climate finance through, in Indonesia, first, strengthening the fiscal policy, second, developing innovative financing instruments, third, improving access to the global finance, and fourth, promoting investment. Fiscal policy is very important. So as part of strengthening fiscal policy and to ensure the climate-friendly budget, since 2014, Indonesia has introduced mitigations and following for adaptation in 2018, budget taking or low emission budget taking and scoring systems in a key ministries to track resources spent to achieve the national emission reduction target. The climate budget tagging is integrated into the national planning and budgeting system. And the climate budget tagging provide comprehensive data on climate change relevant spending, enabling government to make informed decisions and prioritize climate investment. Climate budget tagging also encourage planning officers and policy managers or policymakers to incorporate climate consideration into the project design. So then we will have the fiscal climate friendly. And the second effort is to develop various innovative financing instruments. Indonesia has been developing innovative financing instruments to support the SDGs as well as NDC implementation in Indonesia. One of the innovative instruments is Green Sukuk or Green Islamic Bond. So in March 2018, the government of Indonesia, through the Ministry of Finance, issued the very first sovereign Green Sukuk in US dollar. In 5 years, issuance raised 1.25 billion US dollar and reached a broad range of investors, including conventional, Islamic, and green investor. And in fact, the issuance was oversubscribed, so signaling the growing market demand for sustainable responsive investment. And the Green Sukuk in Indonesia is an excellent example of pioneering role of government in leveraging the private finance for green sustainable development. And just a month ago, Indonesia issued the other type of Green Sukuk. We call it a retail Green Sukuk. It's for individual investor. And we launched the individual Green Sukuk with inviting millennials, and they are investing their money for buying our green retail sukuk. Another strategy is to improve the access to the global finance. Of course, many of us are having a painful experience in accessing this global climate finance, but we have to keep the spirit high, and we have to just keep doing things. So we need to improve the access of global finance, and among others is UNFCCC financial mechanism, the Global Environmental Facilities, and the Green Climate Fund. So through these negotiations, Indonesia is pursuing or trying to make more direct access of this global climate finance. And another strategy, the fourth strategy, is leveraging the private sector investment. And one of the strategy, and is also part of the other innovative financing instrument, we call it SDG Indonesia 1. SDG Indonesia 1 is a platform to support the infrastructure development in achieving 16 out of 17 SDGs targets. SDG Indonesia 1 is a blended finance platform managed by PT SMI. PT Sarana Multi Infrastructure is one of the state-owned company to facilitate the involvement of philanthropists, donor, climate fund, green investor, multi-donor bank, multi-development bank, international agencies, commercial banks, sovereign wealth fund, and other investor. And there are 4 types of the products, namely development facility, de-risking facility, financing facility, and equity funds. And it covers a range of sectors, including health, education, renewable energy, urban structures, including water and waste management. And the last example of innovative instrument, it has been discussed, has been explained by Dr. Sugardirman, that mandated by the government regulation number 46 of 2017 and presidential decree number 77 of 2018, government of Indonesia is establishing, we call it a public service agency for managing the environmental fund, or in a short, LH fund. LH means lingkungan hidup in English, environment, so environmental fund in short. So LH fund will obtain fund 4.3 trillion rupiah as an operational capital from the government through the 2020 state budget, national state budget. And not only that, the LH funds will also receive operational transition fund from the Forest Development Financing Center up to 2.1 trillion Indonesia rupiah, as well as donation from other environmental care institutions and bilateral cooperations on RADD, for example. This LH fund will carry out the financing function so that the funds managed can be invested in profitable investment or instrument. The goal is to manage fund to grow and meet future environmental program funding needs, including the climate change. And we will prepare the LH fund to be the very competent financial institutions, and hopefully will be accredited by the global climate mechanism. So I think that's all that I will share with you. And to conclude, I just would like to mention that unlocking financial for sustainable development, including the climate finance, is a challenge of our times that we must address head on. And based on various financial schemes being taken by all stakeholders, especially in Indonesia, it shows us that commitment, collaborative, and innovative policy actions are important elements to meet the need of the climate actions by all. I thank you for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Ibu Dewanti. We heard from her there are some innovative climate instruments in Indonesia, and dealing with fiscal policies. There are some instrument, climate budget tagging, to monitor government spending on mitigation and adaptation since 2014. And there are at least 4 different innovative climate instruments, from green Islamic bonds up to environment funds, the last one. So we will discuss more about this. The last but not least, I'd like to invite Mr. Simon Buckle from OECD. He is the head of climate change, biodiversity and water divisions. And he is going to talk about the lesson learned of governing and scaling up climate finance from OECD. Please, Simon.
So thank you very much for inviting me today, and it's a great pleasure to be here with colleagues who we know for very well in the context of the OECD, and it's been a great pleasure to work with Lakshmi in particular over the last few years. So it's nice to be here. I hope I cover what you want to ask me about, but if not, just ask. There's plenty of time, I think, to discuss as well. So I gave it a general title, Unlocking Climate Finance, and within this, there's a lot to cover. I wanted to say something really at the outset just about the financing problem for green or low carbon type investments, and to also say something about the risk and return issues for climate. I wanted to talk about institutional investors, because that's a big pool of money that potentially, is needed and needs to invest in these sustainable assets long term if we're going to have sustainable pensions and insurance companies and so on. Then I was going to talk about the international climate finance flows, where we've done some analysis. And then finally, just to mention briefly some work that we're doing in the Asian region, and very happily with Indonesia in terms of a program that's been funded by the Danish government. So that's quite a lot, and I'll cover it briefly. There's things I left out, like the EU is developing a taxonomy of sustainable economic activities, and I've been involved in that over the last year. I've not put any slides in there on that because it would just take too long, but if that's interesting in questions, there are things like that we can pick up. So just really to begin by putting some scale on this, if you think there's something like 20 trillion of investment in fixed assets globally, the energy sector is an important sector within this, just under probably $1 trillion a year at the moment. And this chart here shows something from the IEA, from the International Energy Agency, not from the OECD, although the IEA is a sister organization. And it's really the energy sector investment needs in Southeast Asia under different assumptions for climate scenarios. And the top number in each of these is 2018. That's just the year. That's the investment. Then you've got two scenarios. One is the stated policy scenario, STEPS, which is basically saying what would happen if governments did everything they said they were going to do, and what would be the investment needs. And the SDS is a scenario that takes you below 2 degrees, and I think gives you a 50-50 chance of getting to about 1.65 degrees in this century. So that's quite an ambitious, strong action scenario. And you see the investment needs there for that one. So those are the three blocks, and then we've got three different categories. Energy efficiency, that's a big investment need in lots of economies to help us to meet Paris goals. Fuel supply, so that's imports and production of fossil fuels, for example, but also maybe low carbon fuels. And then the power sector itself. And you see what happens is that as you get more ambitious and you have a chance of meeting the Paris goals, you need to really step up your investments in energy efficiency big time. That has the benefit that you actually spend less on fuels. So you make savings there. So what you're spending, you recruit some of that in fuel savings each year. And in the electricity sector in particular, you have to make big investments in renewables, but you reduce the spending on fossil fuel generation. So those are the patterns. That's the big pattern that you see in this chart that the IEA has produced. So moving on, if renewable technologies and clean technologies and energy efficiency are so good, and they are, why has funding them been so challenging? And there are different reasons in different countries, and we all know that there's a problem just in terms of financial flows to developing economies. So if we put that to one side and take that as a fact, but then we look at the climate-specific reasons, it may be that the risks and returns are not compelling for private investors. But why? I mean, energy investment is profitable for many, many industries. Hugely profitable, makes sense. Quite often, the returns don't always take into account the social benefits. They're just looking at narrow private benefits. So they don't take into account improved health, fewer climate damages in future, impacts on other countries and other communities. Firms and investors are often focused on the short term, so they only think a few years ahead. They're not taking account of the long-term changes that we're making to our climate and to our ecosystems and the very planet we live on. And there's a worry also about policy credibility and stability. And that's why it's important to have very strong political leadership and direction and a good stakeholder buy-in, a cross-party buy-in to these sorts of policies, because they take a long time to have an impact, and you need stability over that time to give the investors confidence to put their money into these new technologies. And of course, the new technologies themselves are not as well understood by investors. Maybe the costs of technologies are uncertain. We've seen how rapidly renewable technologies, particularly solar PV, but also wind, have fallen in cost. Solar came down by something like 70% between 2010 and 2018. That's a huge reduction and makes it now very competitive with many fossil fuel generation options in many countries. And in some countries it will be the cheapest option. Also, investment firms, banks, they need people to evaluate projects, and it's a new business, it's unfamiliar, so they don't always leap into it as quickly as perhaps they should. And sometimes, particularly for things like energy efficiency, you have transaction costs. You've got a lot of small opportunities, and you somehow need to aggregate those to a scale that an investor might feel is interesting. And the difficulties in moving this money spurred the Bank of England Governor Mark Carney to make a speech in 2015 about the risks, and that also led him to establish under the FSB a task force on climate-related financial disclosures. And that's an important development in mobilizing climate finance that's worth just highlighting here. But it's not enough on its own without a good policy environment, I would argue. The three key dimensions of climate risk that are relevant here that Mark Carney highlighted, it's the physical risks, it's climate impacts, it's the damage to people, to ecosystems, to infrastructure that will come about from more extreme events, also from the slow onset events like sea level rise and so on. It's the transition risks, so some very, very fossil intense economies, if they're going to make this transition quickly, will face some assets that are no longer economic to use, especially if you have policies in place like carbon pricing that make coal generation so expensive, they make gas generation even more expensive than many, many other options. And so what I've shown here is the sort of emissions curves that are needed to reach the Paris goals. And you can see how steeply we have to accelerate our reduction in emissions. And that means some facilities that are being built now, and we've seen just in the press over the last week, the number of gigawatts of new coal plant that are still being built in China, but also elsewhere in Asia. And these are assets that may not actually have an economically viable future. They may become stranded assets if we really take these commitments to Paris seriously, which we should. They may not be able to operate for their full life. They may not recover all the money that's been invested in them. So the transition risk is a big risk for investors and for firms. And then, of course, if we don't take action and there are damages and people suffer, there's always the risk of legal liability. And we've seen that increasingly in other health cases, but I think we'll see that more and more in climate and also in biodiversity issues too. So those are the three key risks that you need to take account of if you're an actor in this space, whether you're a company, a country, or a financial investor. Policies are key, and I was really pleased to hear how Indonesia was doing the climate tagging in its fiscal budget. I thought that was really very good, and it's at the cutting edge of what people are doing, and I think that's great. One other thing that we always advocate is we have to price the externality, we have to price the social damages, and most emissions in the world are not priced at a level that would change behaviors sufficiently, and there are good and bad reasons for that. Sometimes people are worried about energy affordability for the poorer people. Sometimes it's jobs and competitiveness. So we have to tackle those issues in parallel with raising the carbon price, because we have to make the low carbon investments more profitable. The low emissions investments, whether it's in renewable power or in sustainable forest management, more attractive than doing the bad option. So we need to price the externalities. And we also need to remove damaging subsidies. And again, this is somewhere that Indonesia has actually done some very good things, and it's reduced its own subsidies significantly since 2014-15. And when you think that fossil fuel subsidies between 2010 and 2015 were somewhere between just under 400 billion to over 600 billion a year, and it varies with the fuel price, that's probably about 8 to 10 times the amount of support that goes into developing renewable technologies. So this is a huge negative incentive we're giving globally, and it's nice to see that Indonesia is tackling that. One, I mentioned the problems with carbon pricing, that it might exacerbate concerns about affordability or jobs or competitiveness. And so in a report that we published just at the time of the Climate Action Summit in September in New York, accelerating climate action, mitigation policies, or refocusing policies through a well-being lens, we said you have to put people at the center of mitigation, and we have to think about mitigation in an integral way with the rest of our economic and social policies. And so what we argue is you need a change of perspective, whether it's looking at how you design cities and transport systems together, how you farm, how you run your electricity system, whatever it is, heavy industry, another example. We need to change the way we measure progress, and we need to change the policy design. And I won't go through the full report, but what this then will do is to allow us to get a better alignment of our policies across the economy, and will also increase the incentives for short-term action on climate mitigation. Because if you can get the health benefits as well as the emissions reductions together, then politically and socially that's a much stronger case for acting more aggressively and earlier. And that will help generate more money in the system as well. So that's the report if you want to have a look at it. Just moving on now to institutional investments. We've been collecting data for the G20 over a number of years, and we've looked at a lot of projects. It's not truly representative, but it's a big sample of projects in different sorts of clean energy. And we find that renewables, unsurprisingly, is the dominant form of energy that's being financed, especially wind. But we looked at the public interventions that helped this to happen, because when you don't have strong price signals from a carbon price, you need to improve the risk-return ratio for the investors. And sometimes that's done by the public sector taking some sort of role, or an institution taking some sort of role. So we found that in these projects, the institutional investors, who've perhaps got over 50 trillion euros of investments globally that could go into these technologies, we find that most of their investment actually is going through unlisted equity funds. So it's not going through the bonds, it's going through unlisted equity funds. It's very hard to get information about what's happening then. In fact, more than 2/3 of the projects we looked at received this institutional investment through different intermediaries, whether it's asset management companies or these equity funds. And crucially, to get that money flowing, there was this public role, this public intervention. And the sorts of interventions that were made were public invested alongside private investor, or the public sector made a cornerstone investment. That's taking 50% of the ownership of the project or the entity. It might make a loan on soft terms, or it might give a guarantee so that the risks are reduced. It might also give grants. And there's a range of different instruments that can be used. And different institutions make use of different types of financial instrument to help the private sector co-finance these things. So it's interesting to see a new institution in Indonesia, which maybe is not quite like a green investment bank. That's the one that's actually been involved most in these projects here. This is 79 times a green investment bank that was involved, the government directly in 62 cases, and a national development bank in 55 cases. MDBs obviously are an important player internationally, but they're not, interestingly, not the biggest necessarily in all cases. Export credit agencies and so on. So there's a lot of players in this space. And each one uses different tools. So green investment banks that are often about creating markets in new areas, maybe in energy efficiency or in the UK in offshore wind. They don't make much use of loans. Development banks, on the other hand, do tend to make more use of loans and make limited use of equity investments. So that's an interesting facet of this new fund in Indonesia. How will that develop? What niche will it take? So now moving on to international climate finance and the developed countries' 100 billion pledge. We've done some estimates over a number of years of where the progress was. We did this first before the COP21 meeting in Paris, which were the 2013-14 estimates there. And the latest estimate brings us to 2017, where we have public finance at just about 54 billion, and then another 14.5 billion of private finance, and we counted just over 2 in terms of export credits that was flowing to developing countries for action on climate. This is still short of the 100 billion. There's a few years to go, and we'll see how they do. And it's broadly in line with what we projected after the Paris COP as to how the public finance would evolve. But the private finance hasn't grown as quickly as we had expected initially. And we've got better estimation methods now that show that the public finance is not actually really a big part of this story yet. It's maybe 20% of the flows. So the public increased 44% between 2013, 14 and these more recent estimates. But we need to get up to 66.8 billion to be on the trajectory that we forecast in 2016. And even that might not be enough to reach 100 billion. So there needs to be continued efforts by the donor governments to scale up public climate finance for developing countries and to improve the effectiveness with which they mobilize that money. And I'm going to just click through that quickly because I've taken a lot of time. So just to highlight briefly that we are engaging with Indonesia on this Clean Energy Finance Investment Mobilization Program, and this was the picture from an event in Jakarta from the 8th of November, which my director, Rodolfo Lassi, and the program director, Cecilia Tam, attended, and it had great interest and attendance from different parts of government, institutions, project developers, and so on. And the program's going to have 3 strands. One is to actually do a sort of review, a policy review of the clean energy finance and investment landscape to see if there's some lessons that may be to be learned or we can learn from Indonesia, because there's a lot going on actually. I think there's some very innovative stuff. Yes? You're there. Then there'll be some capacity building, some facility for technical assistance as well on particular policy challenges where we'll be able to bring expertise from different countries or from the IEA or the OECD. And then there's going to also be in-country investor dialogues where we can try to catalyze links between investors and project developers so that we can try to help speed up this flow of finance into projects in Indonesia. So we're very excited by that, and we look forward to working with you closely. And I think just to say thank you very much for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bako. He already mentioned about information regarding with global experience in climate finance. He also asking us why has financing climate mitigation has been so challenging. I think it's a very, very important questions. So we can also ask, why has financing climate adaptation has been so challenging as well? Because I think for developing countries and the countries has prone area for climate change, I think is adaptation issue will be very, very important. So without further ado, I'd like to ask audience whether there is some questions or comment for these three speakers. Please, we still have time around 20 minutes to discuss. Yes, ladies, one, two, and you as well, no? Yeah, please indicate your name and also your institution and probably your country.
Good afternoon. My name is Titi Suntoro from AXI Indonesia. We are monitoring the Green Climate Funds and has a lot of work to do with the Indonesian NDA at the Ministry of Finance. So my question is about the NDC. How is the gender mainstreaming efforts to build the NDC? Because there is a lot of call that the NDC also has to pay attention at the situations of the women, because at the end projects, if we look at the NDC programs, whatever at the end, it will be in the form of projects, that it will then affect women and their community if there is not careful being designed. So because there is also some base, also there's no regulation or law, but there is already some base from the Bapenas, for example, on the gender mainstreaming, or the presidential instruction in 2000 about gender mainstreaming in the development. So I'm really curious to know about this, because the last speaker also mentions about, you know, people, in this case also women, should be in the center of the efforts of climate action. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam. Before the second question, this question is, although it's not directly with finance, but it's also very, very important for us. NDC and gender. Probably Pulaksmi could give short, or the DG.
Okay, thank you, Ibu. From your question, is very challenging for us. We aware that gender is one of the main of the impact to the genders. So that's why in the negotiation we also send the lead negotiator for the gender issue in this COP. So in several COP we also include the gender negotiator for that. And for NDC, one of the activities NDC is also the activities on the adaptation and mitigations. We have a program, village program Kampung Iklim. So it's a village climate village program. So in that activity, the most actor is women. So we include the women on this activities in the ground. So we aware that who is involved in this activities is women. So we include gender in this our NDC activities. Yeah, maybe Bu Ami bisa menambah. Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Indeed, on the various financing instrument that I explained, there is no specific policy on the gender mainstreaming. But since we are under the government effort, so we need to obey and to follow the general rules that you mentioned, that Indonesia already have the gender mainstreaming. And in trying to implement all the instrument, we would like to also acknowledge that it is important to implement the gender sensitive budgeting. And we try to provide equal access to men and women. But as you mentioned, as you may already aware, that there is still a challenge in the implementations with regard to the formality documents, that kind of things. But there is no such a policy related to gender bias in those instruments. I'm happy to learn from you, maybe later on how to mainstreaming or to make all the financing instrument a gender-sensitive policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Bu Lakshmi. So I like to, oh yeah, please.
No, I'd just like to, welcome the question. I think it's a very important one, and I think that climate impacts, both on how we address climate, but also the impacts of climate, do have differential impacts, and we need to take very careful account of that. So I think it's a very topical issue for an NDC camp.
Thank you, Mr. Bakal. So I'd like to invite you, Madam. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Muna. I'm from Sudan, Institute of Environmental Studies, University of Khartoum. Yes. I just have first a little comment, which I observed that public sectors are contributing maybe more than the private sector. Yes, I don't know what makes it attractive for the private sector to contribute more than the private sector. I heard something about soft loans and enabling environments for these people. The second thing about the NDC, for the different sectors, they have different emissions. Okay, so is there any percentage targets for the different sectors for the year maybe 2030 or something like that?
Yeah. Thank you, Madam. First, Mr. Bakal.
Thank you very much for the question. So how to make it more attractive for the private industry? Well, I think there are some basic things for any investment. As you mentioned, the enabling environment is critical. Good governance, good institutional frameworks, rule of law, all these things are very, very important. And then specifically on the climate side, I would say we need these good policies. We need policies where people have confidence for the long term that they're going to, that the renewable asset is going to be viable, it's going to give you returns. And that was the benefit of early on when solar power and wind power were just getting started, we had feed-in tariffs that gave extra return to some of the investors. And now the costs have come down, they don't need that so much, but they do need to know that they're going to be able to sell their power. So if you've got a state-owned operator operating a grid and they're not putting the grid in the right place for these people to be able to sell their power, that's going to be an obstacle. So there are going to be some things that are to do with the governance, the institutional management of the grid and the electricity markets, as well as things like carbon pricing and getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies. But I think for some of the frontier technologies still, like offshore wind in some countries is still very challenging. I mean, in the UK it's becoming more and more accepted and the costs are coming down. It's still quite expensive. But some countries have very little experience with that. So you're going to need to think, are there still additional returns that will be needed by the private sector, or does the risk get taken more by the public sector for those new technologies to make them come in? But really there's a lot of money that's looking for safe homes with good, solid returns, and the sorts of energy infrastructure investments that you make in renewables, or the constant return you get from energy efficiency investments in buildings, should be attractive. And it's a question of can we get the conditions right? And it's a number of different things. It's the governance, it's the rule of law, but it's also having good policies in place. And then we need to build knowledge of these products, the green bonds, they're just raising something like, I think it's over 200 billion globally this year, but that's 4% of all the bonds that have been issued globally. So this is still quite a small part of the market. So we need to scale up awareness of these instruments. We need to get the policies right, and we have to do it fairly quickly. You're right. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Rwanda, what?
Yes, second question about the NDC. How we divided the target from the different sectors? We calculate from the historical of the every sector's emissions. For example, we have a historical data from the forestry sector since 1990. So we know the emission of from the forestry sector is very high. So we have to reduce the deforestation rate to keep the deforestation low, and then we can achieve our NDC. From the energy, start from 2000, I think the historical data as a business as usual. So how we can reduce the emission as a business as usual to achieve our NDC. So all of this sector, 5 sector, why this a different percentage to reduce the emission, because we calculate from the historical data as a business as usual. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Rwanda. Here, please.
Hi, Munya, I'm a PhD student. I have a question regarding the acceptation.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
What's your name and
Sorry.
which country are you from?
Munya Mostefawi, I'm from France. I'm a PhD student at La Sorbonne in physics of climate change. And I have a question regarding the social acceptance of a carbon tax, how it's possible to make it socially acceptable. In France, we had the yellow jacket crisis, and yeah, I just wanted, just curious about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Wami. How about you? You can mention.
Okay, so that sounds like it's a question for me then. So just to give people some context who perhaps don't know everything about this, and I'm not an expert on the Gilets jaunes in France, but clearly this change to a low carbon society and the change in prices that will affect fuels and energy, transport, housing, all these things are going to have social, economic impacts. And those are going to be more or less severe depending on your economic structure, your tax structure, and also how people live and the options they have. So in France, there's quite a high tax on transport, and if you live in Paris or a big city, it's okay. You've got a very good public transport system. You can use the metro, and you can get about, and it's really cheap and very good. And in other cities as well, there's light rail and so on. But if you're living in a smaller town or in a rural area and you're commuting to a city for your work, often you have to do this by car. There's no other option. And so if you put up the fuel costs on the car, and then other costs in the economy are going up too, and maybe you're not earning a really high wage, you're going to start feeling the pain. And I think that was one factor on top of an existing structural feeling in France that Paris, dominated everything. It was too important, it was too central, and policy ignored the vast part of the rest of France. So this was a policy that came on top of an existing problem, and I'm not French, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but this seems to be my take on this. And so it wasn't just a climate or a carbon price problem, it was a structural social problem, but this was sort of ignited by the fact that suddenly there was this increase in tax. And that set back policy, and that's what we have to try and avoid. And we have to try and think about the impacts, the social and distributional impacts of policy a long time in advance. Now, I think the French government did, but they did it probably in a way that was blind to the spatial distribution of inequality, and they probably just looked at income inequality. That's, again, me guessing. It's not a published OECD view. And so it came as a bit of a surprise to people because they hadn't realized the impact that this was going to have and the strength of feeling it would generate. And it's really this issue of, can we make the transition to a low emissions world socially, politically feasible, that occupies a lot of my time. That's what I've been thinking about for 8 or 10 years when I was at a university and now at Imperial College, now at the OECD. And this is why we published this report on accelerating climate change. This is why the Secretary General gave a speech a couple of years ago in Canada trying to outline the benefits and the risks of climate action and how we have to reduce the risks for distribution, for vulnerable communities, but also to try and build on the co-benefits like better air quality for our children and for ourselves, better nutrition and diets, more accessible cities so that we don't have to have long commutes by car where we spend 2 or 3 hours in a car to get to the job. And we've just got to think about how we make these transitions feasible. This isn't an environmental problem. Climate change is not an environmental problem. It's a problem for our whole way of development. And until we realize that, we're not going to deal with it in the right way. And we're going to come out with little slogans that say, oh, put a carbon price on it, it'll solve it. No, actually, we've got to think a little bit more carefully about how we make that carbon price acceptable. Because yes, we do need to price the externality, it's what will drive incentives, but we can't do it if it's going to cause a backlash that then sets policy back for 2 or 3 years. We haven't got time for that. We need to do this in a good way. So we need to find out where the sticking points are, where the tricky things are, and anticipate those. And then we can also build infrastructure that gives people more options, and that helps make increases in carbon price more acceptable if you have the good public transport, if you have these options. So it's not easy, but we should be able to do this. This is not something that we should, we understand about problems of implementing government policy and the distributional impacts, and this is something that we should be factoring in more into our climate policy, and I'm sure in Indonesia you do that. But
Kwame?
Yeah, I would like to add, well, we have not yet have such a carbon tax in Indonesia, but allow me to share some experiences in discussing environmental tax. I think back 12 years ago, at the time government of Indonesia was trying to introduce so-called environmental taxation into the regional retribution and regional tax law. And because you're asking about the social acceptance in this regard. And at the time, we were not successfully include the environment tax into the law finally. Because of what? Because of at the time we are not, the government is not clear enough telling the community, tell the people on how the tax will be spent for. So I think transparencies and equal justice is important to be communicated, because we not only would like to implement such a additional tax like carbon tax or environmental tax only for generating a new revenue for government. That's one point. But we need to see the whole structure of the taxations. We need to shift the burden. We need to shift the tax itself, because we need to avoid any unnecessary double taxing or triple taxing or maybe multiple taxing on one subject. That's one important. So I think, and the second one is being transparent in how government spend the money, because there is no such a earmark on the tax, but indeed the government need to be transparent and to give back the benefit of the revenue from the tax to the communities. For example, the clean transportations, a good services on environmental quality, that's kind of thing. So I think that's my response. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwame. I think time is running out, so I have to finish the discussions for the last session in this pavilions. But I have some key messages, or we can say is takeaway messages during our discussion. First, of course, finance issue is, I think, is one of the biggest issues when we talk about the climate change actions. And unfortunately, according to some of the speakers mentioned that the challenges to climate mitigations and also as well as adaptation is so high. So this is key message that we have. And dealing with the Indonesia perspective, Indonesia has so many policies to prepare climate change action, both mitigation and adaptations. And again, we believe that the finance is one of the means of implementations, probably the most important things. Like I mentioned that finance is like fuel for engines, so the most important thing of MOI. So that's why government already did some innovative actions dealing with finance, including fiscal policies, innovative climate instruments like green Sukuk, green Islamic bonds, including also global, how to get the global climate finance resources, and other innovative financing instrument. And one thing that we also, Indonesia has just launching is what we call environment funds, just launching this year, October 2019, and hopefully we will have more finance to action on climate change, both adaptation and mitigations. And we didn't have time to talk more on non-public source of funding so far this afternoon. Hopefully the next session, the next discussion, we will discuss more on non-public source of funding. Thank you very much for your attention and good day.
Thank you very much for the moderator of the session, Mr. Wahyudi, and also the distinguished speaker. Before we are ending the session, there is a certificate from the Minister of Environment and Forestry to all of the speakers of the session of Unlocking Climate Finance for Paris Agreement Implementation in Indonesia. So to the moderator, please give out the certificate to all of us. And there's also a token of appreciation from the climate change control to the OECD. And now please take a photo session for all the speakers and the moderator. Okay, thank you very much for the session of Unlocking Climate Finance for Paris Agreement Implementation in Indonesia. And that concludes of our session in Indonesia Pavilion today. Tomorrow we are going to have 7 sessions. Another interesting session of climate will be held here. So if you want to know the detailed agenda, please go to the indonesiaunfccc.com. Thank you very much for your attendance today, and see you tomorrow for the next discussion.